Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Miriam Aliso, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Vocational Rehabilitation, VR, and Post-Secondary Education, Understanding the Obstacles and How to Overcome Them. Next slide.
Thank you so much, Miriam. This is Josie Badger, and I have the privilege of being the co-director of the RAISE Center, which is hosting this event today. Along with myself, of course, we have Miriam, we have Peg Kinzel, who is the co-director with me. We have Deborah Jennings, who is the executive co-director of SPAN. We have Donna, and she and Miriam both do the resource and product coordination. We have Maria, who does a lot of administrative assistance and really helps us out a lot. And we have Jessica Wilson, who is the director of communications and helps make sure that this all goes out smoothly. Go ahead. So we are delighted today to have another webinar with our friend Ron Hager at the National Disability Rights Network. And this presentation is on vocational rehab and post-secondary education, understanding the obstacles and how to overcome them. Go ahead. And so at this point, I will be turning it over to Ron to talk about our subject today. And as was mentioned, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box, and you will have there will be opportunities to answer them throughout this session. So thank you, Ron, for joining us.
Thank you, Josie, and thank you everyone else for inviting me. And it's a privilege for me to be here today. We have to put this disclaimer in because it's under a federal grant. It's actually under a different grant than this grant, so but we can use it. We just have to put the disclaimer in. I think I lost the slide now here. What happened? Someone just changed that one. Oops. Oh, okay, there we go. I'm back. Okay. Karen Welch, who still works at the Neighborhood Legal Services in New York, the New York P&A program, used to be the P&A. She was a client assistance program attorney for many years. And she put together these case examples that we're going to see throughout the presentation. We also have a video, hopefully we can get it to work for you, about the Think College program. If it won't play today, it plays, but we may or may not play, it may not be audio. You'll have the link and you'll be able to use it independently. But it's a good, that's kind of the last slide of our session today. So this is all part of the obligations of the Rehabilitation Act, originally passed in 1973. It was amended by the Workforce Investment Act several years ago, and most recently in 2014, it was amended again by what's called the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA, in 2014. The final regulations came into effect on September 19, 2016. And all the material you have today is based on the most recent regulations and everything else. So it's most up to date we can possibly get. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jessica, who has a question for you, everyone.
Hi. Next slide, please. We are asking this poll, and the question is vocab. All right, sorry. So poll is, VR is not required to pay for private tutoring for a student who may need it before or during college. And we'll collect the responses for a few more seconds. All right. Oh, we still have some voters. Still some people voting. Okay. Polling is closed, and our results. So you are at the right webinar.
Totally. That's awesome. And we will be getting to that question quite a ways in, but we wanted to have one right up front because that is one of the common obstacles to VR funding of higher education. So here's a list of the obstacles. The presumption of entry-level employment goals, which would sometimes preclude college altogether. The requirement for VR clients to pay for part or all of the services. The rates of tuition schedules and how that would affect college funding. Timeliness of amendments to the IPE, the Individualized Plan for Employment. Delays in receiving services. And this is the last one. Getting VR to pay for remediation prior to college. So you guys would have to be patient. We figure we have you wet your whistle. So you have to wait for the entire webinar almost before you find out the answer. Okay, so a few general guidelines for this. Any vocational rehabilitation service has to be based on the client's employment goal and has to be necessary to enable the person to meet the goal. So you have to have your employment goal clearly spelled out in the IPE, and then you could build on the need for post-secondary education to get to that employment goal. You've got to connect your goal with the need for college. The more you put down specific details in the IPE up front with what the services are, what the timelines are, the better you will be going down the road. And so we're going to get into more of the details, but that's just the kind of common theme of all of this. You have to make sure your employment goal is one that would require college or other types of vocational or whatever training, and then you would then have in the goal, and then the IPE, all the services, which could include college. So the obstacle number one, the presumption of entry-level employment as the employment goal. There's a lot of cases over the years that have fought, not as much for college, but for advanced degrees, law degrees, masters of social work. Those have been the two that have been litigated the most. And under WIOA, they really did a great job of helping to clear this up. Because, and this is right from the regulation, the law encourages qualified individuals to pursue advanced training but it's not limited to science, technology, engineering, or mathematics, including computer science, medicine, law, or business. So it's very clear that not just initial college degrees, but even the advanced degree to get to that ultimate employment goal can be included and provided and funded by VR. And you want to be a doctor, so you get the MD. You want to be a lawyer, you get the JD. Depending on your business goal, you may or may not need an MBA. So you have to make sure that if you need or want to go and get an MBA, you have to make it clear that your business employment goal would require an MBA. Same with counseling. A lot of the cases I mentioned had to do with people that wanted to be licensed clinical social workers, for which you need a master's in social work. And it's not listed, the social work's not listed on your screen here, but because it's not limited to, you could also advocate for someone getting an MSW if that was related to their employment goal. Somehow we went backwards. So it's very important, as I said, to look at the specific qualifications that are needed for that employment goal, write the goal with that in mind. And you need to be specific, because a lot of these cases, the person lost under the old rules because it said job and legal services or counseling. And the courts would say, well, you don't need to be an attorney to have a job in legal services. So you could be a paralegal. You don't have to, you can just go for a 6-month paralegal training program. So if your goal is to be an attorney, you're right attorney. And if VR keeps saying, oh, no, 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 just job and legal services, you have to push back, because that's where the fight will be won or lost. Is if you want to be an attorney, you put attorney. If you want to be a doctor, you put doctor. If you want to be a licensed clinical social worker, you put licensed clinical social worker. So here's our first case example. Ms. S was an RN who had earned an associate's degree many years before. She was in her 50s and had developed a severe back injury. She could no longer do any nursing tasks that required lifting. She went to the state VR agency looking for help with employment. Her VR counselor made her work with a job placement agency for almost a year. There were no jobs in the area for which she was eligible because of her lifting restrictions. In frustration, she contacted CAP, that's the Client Assistance Program that advocates on behalf of clients with the VR system. CAP worked with her, and together they identified an employment goal of healthcare case manager. There were many jobs available in that field, but they required a bachelor's degree in nursing. CAP assisted the consumer with getting information on this employment goal from many different healthcare agencies and insurers. She found a program that allowed her to get her bachelor's degree in nursing in 18 months. VR agreed to sponsor her in this program. So here they weren't even looking at like a advanced like master's in nursing, but even fighting to get a bachelor's degree in nursing because she already had a degree. And that's another thing about VR. Even if you've already got one degree, you're allowed to advance in your career. And here in particular, because she couldn't do the work from her original degree, she was able to get approved for the higher degree. So if you have a hesitant VR agency, you definitely have to get all your ducks in a row. Shouldn't have to go through job placement for a year before you can find out there's nothing in the area that you can currently do. But you do have to make sure you have the information to support your position. And here's another example from New York, the master's in social work, which I talked about. In some states, you can get an entry-level position with a bachelor's degree in social work. These jobs tend to be low paid and without much opportunity for promotion. However, in many states, you can only be a licensed social worker if you have a master's degree, and you can only do individual counseling if you have a master's in social work. Make sure that the IPE lists individual counselor or licensed social worker as the goal, rather than employment in social work. Now under WIOA, either a job requiring a master's degree and or licensure could be listed as the initial goal requiring the advanced training. Then so you could start out with a lower level goal and then move on in your career later, or if you wanted to start off right at the bat going for your master's degree, you can do that too. You have either option is available to you. But just make sure, again, that your goal matches the degree that you're seeking. Again, these are all from New York, by the way, but they're not limited to New York because it's very common across the country. Getting VR to pay for a master's degree in teaching. In New York, you can teach without a master's degree once you get your bachelor's of science in teaching. But you need to be licensed, to be permanently licensed, you have to have a master's degree within 5 years. Otherwise, you're terminated. And there were cases in the past where it was very hard to get VR to fund the master's degree. You've already got your degree. You don't need anything more from us. But if you don't get your master's degree, you're not going to be able to maintain your job in teachers. So that's one of the purposes of VR is not you have to get your initial job, to advance in employment, or to maintain employment. And without that master's degree, you cannot maintain employment. So that you would now argue for support to get the master's degree in teaching from VR. Now, you could decide to go right from beginning to end, get your master's degree and be done with it before you start teaching, or you could start teaching and go for your master's degree as you're teaching. It really probably depends on the individual person. For some people, maybe because of the nature of the disability, family dynamics, whatever, they won't have the time or resources or energy to do both teach and go to get their master's program, so they may want to get everything up front. It really is going to be up to the client how they want to pursue it. And then or parents you're working with, students you're working with, they kind of decide how they want to go. Okay, that's the first obstacle. Obstacle number 2, financial participation by clients. State VR agencies are not required to have financial needs tests, but most now do. However, if a state does impose a financial needs test, it must maintain written policies that spell out what it is, how it applies, the services for which it applies. There are certain exemptions, and it must be applied uniformly to individuals in similar circumstance within the same geographic region. In some parts of the country, like in New York, you have New York City, which costs 10 times as much as living in Buffalo. You could have a higher test in New York than you would in Buffalo, for example, but it has to be geographically identified and similar in that region. And they would have to have some rationale, obviously, for why they've done that. Most states have it across the whole states. They don't really have geographic divisions. Now, the financial needs test must be reasonable. It must be based on the individual's financial need, taking into account disability-related expenses, and it must not be so high as to effectively deny a necessary service. The basic point is here, it has to be flexible. So, for example, a financial needs test could be a sliding scale. Like if your income is between $10,000 and $20,000 a year, VR will pay for 100%. If it's between 20 and 50, VR will pay for 50%. If it's between 50 and 100, they'll pay 0. That would be a financial needs test, which would apply to how much money the client would have to kick in on their own. So if you have that general grid of the sliding scale, but someone has a particularly unique disability, for example, with a lot of disability-related expenses or other reasons why that would not apply or would not be applicable or appropriate for them, they have to build in exceptions to the financial needs test. And this is the biggest one here. Any financial needs test cannot apply to people who are recipients of Social Security benefits, either Social Security Disability Insurance, what's called SSDI, Supplemental Security Income, or SSI, or what's called 1619B Medicaid. Someone that has lost cash benefits because of income, but because of a program within SSI, they're still getting Medicaid through the SSI program. They're still, even though they're not getting a cash benefit from SSI, they're still considered to be an SSI beneficiary. Now, here's the issue. Many times the VR, sometimes they forget all about this, and even if the person, him or herself, they'll ask for money. So you'll fill out the financial aid form, and it says, well, this is the student's contribution, and they'll plug it in, even though they're not supposed to be paying anything. The other thing that happens, and probably this is a little more common, is when you do the financial aid form, it's not just the individual student's finances that are looked at, but also the parents, at least up to a certain age. And so they may say, well, the parents can contribute. Even if you, as the SSI recipient, don't have to contribute, the parents can. Well, no, it's the family contribution. Even though if it's coming from the parents, it's still the client's situation. So that if the client is receiving either SSDI or SSI, or this 1619B Medicaid, there can be no family financial contribution. And there's a reason for this. And Social Security put it, or the VR put it in. They said, we want people to get off SSDI. We want people to get off SSI. We don't want to put any barriers in their way. Additionally, if a VR agency funds somebody either SSI or SSDI and they go off benefits, VR gets 100% of its money back from Social Security. So the last thing we want is to be putting barriers and hurdles into people's way. We want to encourage the individuals to get off of benefits. And you're going to be a doctor. It's hard to be a doctor and still get Social Security disability insurance. Most likely, you're going to earn enough to go off benefits. So the VR agency is looking at their own kind of financial picture without looking at the bigger picture and how it should be applying. Next, there's a similar issue that comes up with colleges. comes up in a lot of cases, but particularly in colleges, which we're focusing on. It's called comparable benefits. VR is required to make use of what are called comparable services and benefits before they kick in their own money. So what is a comparable benefit? It's a service or benefit provided in whole or in part by another public agency, health insurance, or an employee benefit. It's not the client. Many times VR agencies are using comparable benefit requirements, for example, for student loans. The student loan is the client's own money. That's not a comparable benefit by definition. In fact, there was a policy by RSA, the Rehabilitation Services Administration, that specifically said that. They revoked that policy, and we met with the director of RSA, whose name is now gone. Anyway, we said, well, what happened to this policy directive? Well, it's gone, but guess what? It doesn't matter. Student loans, by definition, are not a comparable benefit because it's paid for by the client himself. It doesn't meet the definition. So this has been something that's come up quite a bit, and we're going to get into a little bit more on this in a minute. In addition, it has to be available at the time needed. So if you have a person that's on Medicaid, for example, and they're going to be funding a wheelchair, and the person's going to be going to college, but Medicaid is saying, we're not going to fund it, you're going to have to fight Medicaid, and they're getting ready to go to college and they don't have their wheelchair, it's not available at the time needed. So that's another key piece of this. We do want other agencies to be kicking in what they're obligated to pay, but we don't want to have the fight between who's responsible affect the client. The client gets to go forward whether or not the dispute about payment is happening. And also, the service has to be commensurate with what VR would be providing. So it has to be what they really need, not what the other company would pay. Now, for college, this is a wrinkle in the definition of comparable benefits. Under WIOA, they actually added in to the covered services any accommodation or auxiliary aid or service that might be available under the ADA, for example. It used to be actually the opposite. It was not a part of the comparable benefit analysis. Now it is. So if you have a student going to college that might need interpreters while they're in college, or readers for read their textbooks, whatever, the college now has the first obligation to provide any accommodation that would be considered an auxiliary aid or service under the ADA. A little bit more on this issue of what is not a comparable benefit: awards and scholarships based on merit, student loans, which I mentioned, the plan for achieving self-support, which is really your own money. You set aside money that you get from one source, and then that money you've set aside into the PASS account, you get SSI to supplement and replace that money. In a sense, you're saving this money, but it's ultimately your money, so that's not a comparable benefit. Now, this is another kicker about the student loans. RSA is very clear that they cannot require you, a VR cannot require you to take out a loan. But if you have a loan, they are allowed to consider that in what they provide. And this is currently being litigated in Rhode Island. In Rhode Island, VR said they'll only pay, basically about 1/3 of the cost that the client needed to go to college. And so the client took out a loan. And then they went to appeal it. And the hearing decision was, well, you got this loan, so you don't have to, VR can consider the loan because you got the loan. Well, the only reason they got the loan is because they were required to take the loan. So it was not a voluntary loan; it was a mandatory loan. And so the Rhode Island, it's in state court, state court in Rhode Island. They're fighting about whether that was really voluntary or not, and so whether that rule should apply. But so as you're counseling clients, or if you're a client yourself that's considering college, you get the financial need form, you fill it out. Just say no. If you're going to go for VR's funding, just say no to the student loan. No, not taking a student loan. And then VR would be required to kick in the full amount. We're going to get to that a little bit more in a second. Additional details about the comparable benefit. As I said, that if progress toward achieving the employment outcome is going to be delayed, then they don't have to, they should not be using comparable benefit. They should kick it in. If there's an immediate job placement at risk, or if there's medical issues at risk, they don't even go through the comparable benefit analysis. They just provide it. And they can always determine who pays later. We're going to stop for questions after this slide. So the last piece on comparable benefits, there's supposed to be interagency agreements between the public agencies within the state and the VR program. Medicaid, the school system, higher education, public higher education. And these agreements are supposed to spell out what happens when. Well, what happens if you have a guy or gal who's a Medicaid eligible that's going to be going to college? Who's going to fund what? Many of these agreements are very vague. You do what you do, we'll do what we do, and never the twain shall meet. But the whole point of these agreements is to try and give clear guidance to these agencies of who pays for what and what specific circumstances. It's concrete so that everyone knows who's going to pay for what, with these clarifications and exceptions built in if there's unique circumstances. But so the better the better and more specific your agreement is, the less fights there will be. This is kind of more of a systems advocacy issue to look at how good your interagency agreements are. So with that, I am going to open it up for questions. Any questions we've seen in the chat box so far?
Yeah, Ron. Okay, go ahead, Jessica.
Okay, excuse me. Yes, Ron, we have two questions. The first one is from Josie Badger, and it says...
Josie, you're not allowed to ask a question. I'm just kidding.
I think she can.
She can.
It's a good one. It's a good one. It says, if your job requires a certification and that certification requires CEUs, will VR pay for those continuing education classes?
I think they could, because it would be required to maintain your employment. Now, here is where the financial needs test could come in. So, for example, I'm in a job, I'm doing pretty good, I'm making $50,000 or $60,000 a year, and I need to maintain my my employment by the CEUs. What is the financial needs test? Even though I could require VR to pay for that that CEU, if I'm over the financial needs test and there's no exception because of my disability expenses, that even though they could fund it, I'm above the financial needs cutoff, and so they would not have to. So you look there at both, is it required to maintain employment, A, and B, where do I fit within the financial needs test?
See, that was a good question, right?
Very good question.
We also have a question from Peg Kinsell that says, what is primary comparable benefit student grants versus VR?
Okay, on grants, and I don't know, they might cover this a little later, but I'll answer it right now. Under VR, you must use any grants that are available, Pell Grants in particular. So if you saw the comparable benefit slide, scholarships based on merit are not considered a comparable benefit, but the grants, Pell Grants in particular, and New York State has a state grant, those would be something that the VR agency would look to. So, and there's going to be a wrinkle on student loans that we're going to get into a little bit. But the basic rule is that the clients would be required to apply for and use any grants. But you still have to look at the total financial need. Sometimes what the VR agencies have said is, well, you can use your grant for tuition, or you have the grant, you can use it you can't use it for housing, you can't use it for this, you only use it for that. When they're looking at the total cost for the client to go to college, they can look at the grants, but they can't say, well, because of this, you don't get this. They have to make sure that your total package between your grants and your VR funding and any other, whatever other maybe you get scholarships, not scholarships, but other things you might have, but they have to make sure that you have enough to go to college, including room and board. If you're going to be going away to college, because there is no local college, for example, they also have to include room and board. That was another issue in this case in Rhode Island. Initially, they were not going to throw in room and board. the client and the advocate were able to change VR's mind before the case went to a hearing. So although they didn't cover a lot of money toward room and board, the client was happy because she ended up getting a roommate, and so the amount that VR was willing to pay was enough. So you have to look at the total cost to the client as well as the total financial package to make sure that they're getting everything met.
Excellent. Thank you. Those are the only questions that we have right now. So,
Jessica, hi. There are more questions on the question panel.
sorry.
Yeah, from Deborah Pickens. She asked, does that include converting class materials to Braille?
Oh, totally. That would be a VR service. Yes. Or it could be, that would be the thing about the auxiliary aider service. That would probably be an auxiliary aider service, making the text available. So that would be something that the college would have the obligation to provide under the ADA. But let's say the college says, hell no, we're not going to do it. We don't think it's something we have to do. And so the person's going to have to go to a lawsuit against the college to get it done. That would be where it's not available at the time needed by the client. So VR would have to kick it in and pay for it. And then you would, they could go after the college if they wanted to. What I would suggest is the way you would do the IPE is every single thing that student is going to need is listed on the IPE, whether or not VR is funding it. So then you list the service, converting text to Braille, college, tuition, VR, power wheelchair, Medicaid. Then everything that's listed is there. And if any one of those components aren't provided in a timely way, you can go back to VR and say, guess what? They're not doing it. You're going to have to do it.
Yeah, there's another question from Michelle S. So she says, so VR will pay for college if eligible. A student doesn't need student loans. I think you already mentioned that, right?
Correct. Yes. No, a student that is seeking VR services is not required to obtain a student loan to help them pay for their own college. It's free. You know, if you're going to, get a service from VR, you don't put your own money in unless they have a financial needs test. So they can't require you to take out a student loan. They could look at a financial needs test and say you don't meet the financial needs test, but it's got to be flexible and it's got to be realistic for people to meet their needs. So you couldn't say anyone that makes over $2,000 a year is going to have to cover 100% of their college. You know, the financial needs test has to be realistic.
Okay. Yeah, there's another question from Cara Georgie. And she says, with accommodations, auxiliary aids and services, you shared that under ADA, the college would need to be providing readers and interpreters first. Is there a long delay in getting them for student? What can the student do?
Well, the first thing is, you can advocate with the college, but you go right back to the VR agency. Go right back and say they're not providing it, even though it's on the IPE. I need it now. I can't wait for college to do it. Okay.
A question from Victoria Sachs. If a Social Security beneficiary is claimed as a dependent on a parent's taxes, does that impact whether VR can look at household income in determining cost sharing?
I don't know of that question. It's very clear that if the client, him or herself, is an SSDI or SSI recipient, that would mean that person, the client or the family, would not have to pay. But if I'm the parent and I have an SSI recipient child, how would that affect my own? If I'm the person, I'm not the SSI recipient, but I'm going to college, I don't know how that would affect it. There would probably be something that would be subject to the VR policy. I said that any financial needs test would have to be a written policy. So that would be something that would be part of it. The fact that that child qualifies for SSI means that the whole family's income is going to be pretty low, because a significant part of the parent's income is deemed available to that SSI eligible child. So you'd have to just see how it all plays out, but they would have to, it wouldn't automatically exempt them from the financial needs test, but would put them in a category where their income is probably going to be pretty low.
Okay, good. So we have two more questions. One is from Bonnie, and she's asking, does the federal law require VR to have exceptions for either a fee schedule or a financial needs test?
Yes. Yeah, we already did the financial needs test where we said it has to be done, and we're going to be getting into, and the fee schedule would be a similar, that's actually my next slide.
Okay.
So yeah, the answer is yes. You're being very, very prescient. Okay.
Okay, we have one more, well, actually two more for Candice Trim. What if an accessible van is necessary to accomplish obtaining a degree and employment?
Well, that's a very good question. It's not a simple one. Transportation is a VR service. Transportation is not a standalone service. VR must provide transportation if necessary to achieve the, but only when it's in conjunction with another VR service. So if VR is funding college and we have a wheelchair user who needs an accessible vehicle to travel to and from college, VR could pay, and this is what they typically do, they could pay a van service to take that person to and from college. If they're, say, living at home, for example. If they're living on campus, if the campus does have a shuttle service, the shuttle service would have to be accessible. If they do not have a shuttle service, for any other students, then VR could be required to, would have to make sure the student was able to get from point A to point B. So that's somehow or other, VR is responsible for ensuring the person gets to and from whatever VR service is being paid for. They are allowed to purchase a vehicle for a person as a transportation service. And logically, if you have a student that's going for 4 years of college, or 7 or 8 years if you had in college and law school, it'd be a lot cheaper for the VR agency to just buy the vehicle outright for that person. But VR agencies tend not to like to do that. So there's a lot of fighting that goes on about that. But they're not required to purchase the vehicle as long as they're meeting the client's needs while they're providing VR services. Of course, once they're done and they have a job, VR does not have an obligation at that point to provide any transportation because they're no longer receiving any VR services. So here is where client planning comes in. The option A is to live in a place with accessible transportation, so you don't need a van. Amy Shearer, who is the Client Assistance Program lead attorney at NDRN, lives in DC. She doesn't really want to drive anyway, but it's personal choice. So she lives in DC because they have a very accessible metro system, as long as it's working. So she can get all around the city anytime she wants on the metro system. And that was her choice. She doesn't need a vehicle. But another person that's going to be working out in the country or whatever doesn't want to live in a city with a metro system. How are they going to get transportation? One of the things that we have advocated for and have been successful for a lot of clients, when instead of fighting VR for the purchase of the vehicle, especially if they're an SSI or SSDI recipient, especially an SSDI recipient, is to have the person set up a plan for achieving self-support, to set aside money while they're in college to pay for the van when they graduate. And the other thing, separate from the van itself, is the accessible features to make the van usable by the person. That sits under a different category called assistive technology or rehabilitation technology. That's a standalone service. So if I got the van and said, here's the van, but I need it to be made accessible, VR could actually do that. In the old days, quote unquote, when I started doing this, the van was the most expensive piece, and the accessories to make the vehicle accessible were not that much money. But as the technology has advanced so much, we have these computer-based digital drive systems that, people that have relatively significant disabilities that would not have been able to drive the old way now can drive. Those systems are not cheap, but that still would be something that VR would have to pay for as a rehabilitation technology service.
Thank you. There's a question from Rose Bowman. How does a 529 account factor into the financial equation?
I don't know the answer to that question. I
Okay.
don't know. It's because it's not a loan. It could be part of the financial needs test. In other words, if the state creates a financial needs test that doesn't just look at income but also resources, it could potentially have an impact. So that would be something you have to check with your state VR agency. It could vary from state to state.
All right.
And I'm going to stop the questions for now because we got to get moving. We're only halfway done. So any other questions, just kind of keep an eye on those because we are going to stop again at the end for additional questions.
Okay, I will.
And these are great questions, by the way.
Yeah, there are four. I will stop them for later.
Okay. Now, for some reason, I'm not moving it again. There we go. Okay, obstacle number 3. Remember, there's 6. So getting VR agencies to make exceptions to fee schedules. That was the question. VR must establish policies for the rate of payment for VR services. They may create a fee schedule to ensure reasonable costs, but the schedule may not be so low as to effectively deny a service. And it must not be absolute and allow for exception. So you have to make sure that the fee schedule is reasonable. If the cheapest tuition in the state is $10,000 and VR's fee schedule is $5,000 for tuition, that's so low as to effectively deny a service, only covering half the service. VR may not place an absolute dollar limit on specific service categories. VR may not place an absolute dollar limit on the total services provided. So we're only going to provide $5,000 for tuition, but we're only going to provide $20,000 total for college. Would be the two examples. They have to meet the cost of the service. Now they could set up, we will pay up to the state tuition rate. That's fine. What happens is typically the VR agency sets a dollar limit on the state tuition rate from 10 years ago. They don't update it. That's not fine. It's got to be based on the current tuition. The other thing is, what about a student who wants to go to a private school instead of a public school? If they want to go to a private school and there is a public school that would have that program that they need, VR can say, we will fund up to the public school tuition rate. The rest is up to you. However, if that public school does not have the service, the training that you need, then the VR would be required to pay for that private school tuition because there is no public school. They have to, and that's a case that's being litigated. I think I think that's part of the Rhode Island case as well. But it's been fought all over the place for VR to make sure, and they do it. They will do it, but sometimes you have to push for it. So here's an example, and this brings in the Pell and the New York State has this tuition assistance program. The state has a needs-based tuition assistance program. VR can require students to apply for these grants as well as Pell grants. Yeah, this is what I was just saying. I knew I covered it somewhere. The VR agency recently changed its tuition policy so that it only pays the state tuition rate from the prior year. It is not keeping pace with the annual increases in tuition, so that's wrong. Additionally, it fixed the amount of student fees it pays to $300 per year and $250 per semester for books. These are categories, not just the overall. Many state colleges have raised their fees to over $1,000 a year, so that's not good. So this VR agency has funding caps that are substantially less than what it costs clients to go even to a state college. So that would be inappropriate based on those rules that I just mentioned. So those funding caps pose arbitrary financial contributions that are not reasonable, and they effectively deny many individuals necessary services needed to go to college. Some VR agencies, this is again this issue, some VR agencies analyze the request for an exception to the funding caps and look at the total financial aid package of the consumer, including any existing loans. This is incorrect. Now, existing loans should not be factored in. That's different based on what we've just found out. Existing loans, even though they're not a comparable benefit and the VR agency cannot require a person to take out a loan, if they got a loan, VR can do it. So make sure you say including new loans, cross out existing loans and put in new loans. They cannot require anyone to take out a new loan. If they got an existing loan, they could be in trouble. And this, we didn't really realize this until we met with RSA a little while ago. Now, there's another wrinkle about the issue of TAP and Pell and other grants. Many individuals that have disabilities may have tried college either before or after they became disabled. If the prior college attempt was unsuccessful, the student may have defaulted on student loans. When the loans are secured by the federal government, the individual will not be eligible for further financial assistance, such as the required grants for college, until the prior loans are no longer in default. What if this individual now seeks to return to college with VR support and does not have the financial ability to get the loan out of default? What happens? VR agencies may fund. Oh yeah, this is the requirement about using loans. The VR agency cannot use Title I funds unless maximum efforts have been made to secure grant assistance in whole or in part from other sources to pay for that higher education. RSA has issued a policy directive to reconcile the requirement to use maximum efforts to secure outside grants and the problem with individuals with disabilities who have defaulted on student loans and that need is not available. You could end up being, you would be in a catch-22. You have to get a loan, you have to get a grant, you've got a defaulted loan, you can't pay the loan back, so therefore you can't get the grant. Therefore, without some reconciliation, you're never going to be able to go to college ever again. So this policy directive, which has been withdrawn, this is ironic. Everyone's been complaining about the Trump administration withdrawing all these policy directives. Well, before Trump took office, RSA dumped a whole ton of policy directives out of the blue, including this one. So the policy, I think, is still a viable direct policy, but it's not chapter and verse based on this directive, but the principles, I think, would apply. The policy said that if an individual with the financial means to do so fails to repay a loan, the VR agency may determine that the financial assistance for which the student is ineligible is in any event available. So I have $10,000 in the bank, I got a $5,000 loan, I'm refusing to pay the loan, so I can't get a Pell Grant. I go to VR and say, I want to go to college. VR can say, you have to use your Pell Grant. I don't have a Pell Grant. Why? Because I got a loan. Pay off the loan. Otherwise, we're going to reduce the amount of your award by the amount of the Pell Grant you could have gotten. I think that's totally legitimate. So they would, like I said, they would deduct the amount of the assistance it would provide by the value of the grants they would have been eligible for. However, this is the more important one. When an individual with limited financial needs cannot make repayment agreements with a lender, the VR agency may conclude that maximum efforts have been made and full VR assistance would be appropriate. And that it talks about the VR counselor needing to make an individualized determination based on all circumstances. That's why I think this is still a good principle, even though it's no longer chapter and verse from this policy directive. I talked about this a little bit as well. I talked about this in relation to public and private schools. The same would apply to in-state or out-of-state schools. The state may have a preference for in-state services, but the preference cannot effectively deny a service. If an individual chooses an out-of-state provider, VR would pay only in-state rate with the individual paying the difference. A state may not establish a policy that effectively denies out-of-state services. They could say only in-state. Now, the other thing is, however, if there is no in-state program, and the only program that would, again, you got to tie it to the employment goal, that would provide the training needed to meet that employment goal is an out-of-state college, then they would have to pay the full cost of that out-of-state college. So the same with a private school. If the public school or the in-state school would provide the training the student needs. The student can go to a private school, can go out of state, but the state would only have to pay for the in-state public school rate. If you don't have a public school program in the state, you can go to a private school. If you don't have a school in the state at all, you can go to out of state. And there are clients the VR is paying for that. Here's another case example. Ms. B's employment goal was to work in business administrative aspects of the healthcare field. In many states, the VR agency sets its fee schedules for college tuition to the in-state tuition rate. Ms. B wanted to attend a health service administration program, but it was only offered at a private college. VR told her that there was a similar program at an in-state school that they would only pay for her to attend the state program. The advocate, this is the issue right here. The advocate worked with Ms. B to obtain documentation from the department head at the private school that showed the uniqueness of the program and that the graduation from its program resulted in a guaranteed placement in the healthcare business field. That last clause is not necessarily required, but it's a good kind of extra bonus. They also got a statement from the state school department that showed the program offered at their school was geared toward individuals interested in becoming personal trainers and did not have a business focus. So if you looked at the title of the program, oh yeah, it sounds like the right program. But then you look at what they actually do, what the actual services are, it's not what the student needs. It's not what the student's goal is. So again, you have to be specific in countering objections from the VR agency to document why it is that you're asking for this and why it's appropriate. That was this case, the in-state, out-of-state wrinkle was there was an in-state program, but the only people that were eligible this is a person who wanted to be an occupational therapist, were people that were already occupational therapy assistants, and she was not. So she was not eligible for that program. But even though the VR was saying that she could have gone to it, so they actually had to come up to the hearing and deal with that. So, number 4, seeking timeline amendments to the IPE. This is a critical piece. A client requires a longer time frame to complete one's education because of the functional limitations of his or her disability. So not only can the VR cannot have absolute service limits, VR also cannot have time limits. They can't say we're only going to fund, oops, it's coming up next page. Forget that, I'm jumping ahead of myself. So I know that because of the nature of my disability, it's going to take me longer to get through college. I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure it won't happen in 4 years. So I might put into the timeline for completion of college a 6-year timeline. And I would do that right up front. If I start college, no problem, everything's great, I'm fine, no problem, 4 years on my goal. Then I realize, you know what? It's not happening. I need more time. Or if I have a mental health disability and I have an issue where I need to drop out for a semester, instead of just going along your happy way and changing what you're doing, bring in VR as soon as you possibly can. Tell them there's a change in circumstances. Then ask them to amend the IPE. A lot of clients have got into trouble by changing things on what they're doing in college, never telling VR. They got to tell VR. If you have a thing up front, great, put it in the IPE. But if you have circumstances change, make sure you tell VR. Make sure you get the VR to change it, because otherwise you're going to be in trouble. In terms of VR saying, well, we're not funding you anymore because you didn't meet the IPE timelines. Well, I couldn't. Well, you never told us. So just avoid that problem right up front. And this is the thing I started to say before. VR may establish reasonable time period for the provision of services, but the period may not be so low as to effectively deny a service and not absolute and allow for exceptions. Now, this is pretty interesting because even students that don't have disabilities are having a hard time getting through college in 4 years, especially a lot of the state schools in New York, I know, because of the way they time this, the classes. You can't get into the class, it's prerequisite for another class. My nephew had to wait for an entire semester. He lost an entire semester because the prerequisite that he needed wasn't available. And so anyway, they can't say we're only going to fund 4 years of college and nothing more. They have to have it flexible. So that they cannot have absolute time limits on the services or on the services to an individual. We're only going to give you 7 things, and you want 8, you can't get the 7th thing. You can only get 7, not 8. So each service needed, both the duration of the service and the scope of services, must be based on an individual need as determined and reflected in the IPE. Another case example here. VR was helping Mr. S attend college in order to obtain a bachelor's degree. Mr. S had health issues related to his disability that prevented him from completing his degree in the 4 years stipulated in his IPE. The advocate helped the client obtain medical documentation, which showed that his medical conditions made it impossible for him to take 15 hours per semester. Instead, his doctor recommended only 9 to 12 hours per semester. The client was granted an exception to the timeline policy. So in addition to the 4-year, 8-year, 6-year thing, there's also credit hour limits. We'll only fund full-time. In full-time is typically 9 hours. So here, they were asking for an exception for the 15 hours. Some clients may even need exceptions to the 9 hours. It's going to be individualized. You're going to have to document why it is based on the individual's disability, that they're not going to be able to meet that goal. And then they're going to say, well, you're too severely disabled to go to college and you're not going to ever get a job, so we're not going to fund college at all. That's a whole other question. But you can get part-time work. And so you can say, yeah, I am going to have to work part-time, but I can work and I can make a lot of money on part-time work. I'm going to be a lawyer. I'm going to be making $500 an hour. I only need to work 1 hour a week. I'm just kidding. But it's possible. I have to throw in something there about those dirty lawyers. Anyway, so that the exception, both in terms of like the number of years it might take, as well as the credit hours per semester, are all things that have to be flexible and subject to individual need. Delays in receiving services, equipment, or accommodation. VR must establish policies related to the timely authorization of services, including any conditions under which verbal authorization can be given. Research and know what the VR policy in your state says, and make sure that the agency is following it, and make sure you follow it. Because many times, like I said, clients will go out and they'll go ahead and apply to college, they'll start college, they're still waiting for VR to approve everything, VR doesn't approve it, and they won't fund the first semester. Or all the services aren't lined up, everything's not in order, and so they end up dropping out or flunking out because they didn't have the accommodations they needed. This was at the time when VR would be the primary provider. So what you need to do is assume it's going to take longer than VR says it's going to take. So that if you're a senior in high school, junior in high school, and you're planning on going into college, start the process right away. You know, if you're a senior, start it immediately. You should have already started it if you're a senior. But if you're a junior, it's not too late to start, because VR has to do the eligibility determination. They have to develop the IPE, determine the services that are going to be needed. So you definitely want to be planning long term. It doesn't happen automatically. The VR may not even know you exist if you're in high school. And the fact that you've talked to it, they may know you exist. And the fact that you've talked to that VR client, counselor, and even if you're getting the pre-employment transition services, that doesn't mean you're a client of VR. You still have to separately apply to VR for VR services. And VR's obligation is to ensure there's no gap in services between high school and college. But I've seen too many times where VR started too late. They told the client, wait till your last semester or wait till your last month, and it's just not enough time. So definitely start the ball early. Find out from other people, how long does it really take VR to get it done? To make sure that, you're not just trusting what VR is telling you, but you know what really is happening in your state. This is a reminder about the fact that colleges now are the primary provider of services. But as we said, in an answer to that question, if the college is not providing it, then you've got to make sure you go back and get it from VR so you don't get screwed up. Authorization of services, as we talked about it, all the services are supposed to be in the IPE, and you're better off getting the services before you start, getting everything on the table before you start, as opposed to waiting and getting it done midstream. And even any changes that you need to make, as I said, need to make sure that you get the changes in to change the IP. It does say that VR does have the ability to do verbal authorization. If they give verbal authorization, definitely get a written confirmation, even if it's in an email. You know, if the counselor says, I know we're running behind, getting close to the beginning of the school year, I'm approving you. Go for it. I'm verbally, our policy says I can verbally approve, I'm approving. Fine. Send an email. This is to confirm your statement to me that you have given me verbal authority to do X. If this is incorrect, please tell me now before I start. And that way, if there's a problem, you've got a written documentation to that effect. You could even ask them to send you an email so that it's not you saying it to them. You know, basically, you just have to be careful to make sure that you're protected. Okay, here is the answer to the first question. Getting VR to pay for classes for remediation for basic academic skills necessary to attend college. And I'll add in, or tutoring while you're in college. The remediation could include a GED, you know, classes. Now, there's a very specific list of services in the Rehabilitation Act statute as well as the regulation. Is tutoring or, you know, remediation a listed service? No, not a listed service. However, there's a catch-all, which is this part in red, other goods and services determined necessary for the individual with a disability to achieve an employment outcome. And VR, not sometimes, but often, will say that we're not going to pay for a college prep or tutoring service because it's not specifically listed. And they'll say, you know, that's not our job. That was the school's job. They're the ones that should have done it. And your response is, the school didn't do it. Here I am. I've got 103,000 IQ, but I can't read the word the. I need remediation for me to go to college. Everyone agrees I can go to college, but I need this tutoring or support before I get there. Or I am in college, I'm gifted in math, but reading, not so much. The college has a mandatory, you know, English language arts a requirement. I'm going to need tutoring to help get through it. Colleges don't, under the ADA, they're not required to provide individual tutoring. It's even under the ADA. It's not an auxiliary aid or service that's an obligation of the college. So what do? So I would argue that VR should, under this catch-all category, because I need it to get through my employment goal. Everyone agrees I can do the job when I'm done. Everyone agrees I can go through college, basically, but I need this support to make it through. And the fact that I didn't get what I should have gotten while I was in high school, can't blame me for the high school's failure to do what I needed. And even if the high school did a great job, there still might, you know, disabilities don't just disappear. There still might be a need for some support services. Obviously, if there are tutorial and remedial classes available at the college, and if that works, that's great, but don't assume it. That's the last bullet point. Sometimes it's not a good match for the client. All righty, so that's the end of the basic obstacles. And this is a new issue, a wonderful opportunity. So before I get to the next point, I want to turn it over for another question. We're probably going to go over by about 10 minutes or so. So I'm going to keep plowing away. Jessica?
Yes, hi. We have our second poll here. May VR pay for college for students with significant intellectual disabilities? And I'll leave it open for responses for about 30 seconds, 40 seconds. A few more seconds. All right, a few more seconds. I think, Oh, no, we still have some people voting. All right. And here we go. I think
Good job, everyone.
paying attention.
Good
You have good
job.
students. Good.
Yeah, no, this is good. Sorry, go ahead, Jessica.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, this is good because this is very new. The whole opportunity is not as new, but VR support for it is a developing field. And we've had some cases across the country where the Client Assistance Program has a fight for it. So this is a brief discussion about post-secondary opportunities for students with intellectual disabilities. In the regulation, we talked about earlier about advanced training, higher education and even, higher advanced degree. The comments to this section in the Federal Register said that, in addition, the vocational and other training services encompass tuition and other services for students with intellectual or developmental disabilities in a comprehensive transition and post-secondary program for students with intellectual disabilities. So at the other end of the scale, students that do not have the ability to graduate necessarily with a regular college degree program and are enrolled in one of these alternative programs that many, many colleges are offering, VR can fund that. So you guys, 91% of you said yes, so that's great. So Think College is a national organization that's dedicated to developing and expanding research and opportunities for inclusive higher education for people with intellectual disabilities. And the thinkcollege.net website is there. And it's got a ton of, I'm not going to go through detail, tons and tons of resources there, including by state, a list of all the colleges that are doing this type of program. Some colleges don't have a residential option, some do. So you can go state by state by state and look at what's available in your state on this website. The research has been pretty good so far, that students that go through these programs, even though they're not getting a quote-unquote four-year official bachelor's degree, the employment outcomes for these individuals that go through this are really good. So this is definitely an option that you need to be thinking about. Generally, these academic opportunities, the inclusive academic, at least 50% focus on academic components with students that do not have disabilities. In other words, they may have their own separate programs for students with disabilities, but at least half the time, half their academic content time is with other students that do not have disabilities, whether it's a credit-bearing course. Don't assume just because someone has an intellectual disability, they can't earn college credit. Auditing, non-crediting, non-degree courses, internships, work-based trainings. So they're integrating the students into the life of the college, both the academic life as well as the residential life in some colleges, as well as the social life. The TIPSID programs, these are the ones that are specifically funded. Originally, were funded through the Department of Education, where you can get financial aid. There's originally 23, now there's 27. So those are the ones that you can get financial aid for that really VR would have to pay for based on this comment. I think we could argue beyond that even if they're in one that's not funded by the Department of Education, you still may be able to get funding. But check with your programs. Now, this slide was done, I think, in the fall, and it was 217 higher education programs. Now there's 265. And I think now there's 28 programs, not 27. So it just keeps going up. And this like I said, this Think College website has a link to what's available in each state. Now here's this video. We're going to see if we can play it for you.
Let me see if I can play it for you from my screen.
And I already posted on the chat box the link to the video. Also.
All right. Let's see if you can.
I think I have a heart in college because I think there's so many ways how kids can look at so many challenges with every things, and there's so many ways how to make a change. All my family pretty much went to college, and I said, why not me? Even though I have a disability, I can still go. I can go anywhere I want to go. The people in school see, oh, she has a disability, don't talk to her, she's so different from everybody else. But here, they accept you as who you are, and they say, you're a person, you're a human being, you're the same thing here.
I like the idea that we're including these students and hopefully giving them a broader educational base to be working from. The students that I have in my class are pretty willing to participate in any number of ways. And the fact that they're coming up with good, cogent answers and comments about things that we discuss in class, if anything, I think has made the other students kind of sit up and go, oh, wait, I need to be paying attention a little more, or reading the material ahead of time like it's been assigned. It's had a very positive impact on the other students, just very clearly. Enjoy them and treat them very much like you would treat any other student. And two, I think remembering why we all teach, which is to create better citizens or help enhance what other people know about our subject area. I love the idea that maybe we're helping these particular students become more productive citizens and more well-rounded citizens of our country. I think it's just really important. We don't have throwaway people. So I'm thrilled to have a little tiny part of that.
Okay.
Thank you. So that's the end of our presentation.
Can you tell me what your
We now want to have any more questions we have. And I see there's a question in the chat box. Isn't the child considered an adult at age 18? Yes. Legally, the child is considered an adult. And under IDEA, they use student. But I'm, 64 years old. My kids are in their 30s. I still call them children. So that's my fault. I'm sorry about that. Any other questions?
There are more questions here, Ron. One
Well,
from
I'm going to stay on. I'm going to stay on and answer all the questions. So if that's okay with you guys.
That's fine with us, with me at least.
Okay.
So if you want, I can read them to you. There are like 8 more questions here.
Okay, let's do it.
I see Nona Nowak. Can you use 36148 6 career advancement to advocate for change of career? For example, going from social work to accounting.
You can get a change in career, yes. It's probably, yes, you can. You can advance in your career as well.
Okay, good. Another one from Barbara Morel. If the parent continues to claim the child with SSI on their tax return, does that impact the FNT?
The financial needs test, it should not. If the person's, if the individual client is receiving SSI or SSDI, whether the parents claiming them as a dependent on their taxes, I think whether they are or not, they're covered under the FOSFA form, the financial aid form, till they're 20-something. It's independent of that. SSI, SSDI recipient, it doesn't matter.
Okay, we have another question from Candice. Can VR close a case if the individual's needs are not met, or if the common method of transportation is not available for the individual?
No. They're supposed to provide the services the student needs to meet their needs, including the transportation they need. And well, we can't get a van to go to college. Well, then buy them a van. I mean, they have to provide the services needed to meet the employment goals. Now, if the student flunks out of college, that's a whole different issue. You may want to look at, you may want to change the goal. Was it the wrong degree program? Did they get the services and supports they needed? So there would be some need to revisit, obviously, if they failed in the attempt, but it doesn't even mean that they would close the services altogether. If the client wants to keep looking and exploring other options, they got to keep working.
Okay, thank you. A question from Lori. So hypothetically, VR could pay for medical school?
Yes.
Okay, another question. If you
It's
need to take...
specifically listed. Yeah, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. The next one is, if you need to take 12 hours in order to receive the federal grant, can you make an exception in the number of hours?
Yeah, that was the issue that I was talking about before. If you have to be eligible for Pell, you have to be on 12 hours. It says that maximum effort should be made to obtain Pell grants. If you can document because of your disability, you cannot maintain 12 hours, then you have made maximum effort and you're not eligible. So the tail does not wag the dog. So you would have to get it, they would have to be able to do an exception, even if you were not eligible for Pell because you couldn't do the 12 hours. Yes, I would say yes. It might be a fight, but I would say that would be one worth fighting.
Okay, thank you. A question from Bonnie Rodogi. When you refer to advocates in the cases you listed, do you mean any educational advocate? Any tips on picking one if you need one?
These advocates were probably the client assistance program advocates because it was written by my former colleague who was a client assistance program advocate. You can use other advocates, but the client assistance people have been specifically trained in doing VR advocacy. That's all they do. So if you went on the NDRN website, there's a link on a map on the home page. You click on that map, it'll tell you where the client assistance program is in every state. In some programs, they're at the same agency as all the other PNA programs. In other states, they're a separate agency. So you would just go to that place, and that would be the place I would start. You can use other advocates. You don't have to use the client assistance program, but that's what they do. And some of the PNAs also that even don't have the client assistance program will also do these cases as well.
Okay, the next one is, I think it's a comment or a question from Karen Adams. Policy change in VR in Georgia is not allowed for new policy change in Georgia states. VR shall authorize and make payment for only those courses and electives outlined in an approved curriculum for required post-secondary certification, diploma, or degree that meets the requirements for a recognized credential from the approved school. Only for courses that lead to the certification, diploma, or degree required for entry level into the chosen employment goal should be approved. This seems to exclude those IPSE programs such as those at Georgia Tech.
Yeah, that would be a problem where, like I said, that they are not approving these programs for intellectual disabilities. So you would have to be advocating for an exception to that policy. So even though we said in the answer to that question, should VR be funding programs for intellectual disabilities, 91% said they should. There's a strong legal argument that they should, but they're not. It is something that probably or could require a fight. There have been a number of cases that the client assistance programs have worked on to get clients funded in these programs.
Okay, we have one question from Young Se Bai. We have an individual with a mental disorder who dropped out college due to her illness. Can she apply VR assistant to pursue another college? She is making progress and wants to go to another college program.
Yes, and the issue with the financial needs and the loans and all that stuff could come into play. They're definitely going to want to make sure, that she's doing well. The counselor that she's working with should support the program, but yes, they can.
Okay, one question from Diana Tavari. Voc services in all categories has closed here in Montana. Cases are being closed daily. We are really in trouble and few people are getting services currently. Ideas for our struggling persons with disabilities.
That's a separate issue, the order of selection. The state is required to provide every service that every client in the state that has a disability with the VR system needs. If the state cannot provide every service that every client needs, they're required to do what's called an order of selection, which is basically a waiting list for services. And so in that case, only the people with the most severe disabilities, and they would have the first priority. So the requirement in the law is that if you have to go to this order of selection, you start with the most severely disabled people in the state. If you serve those, and then you go down to another service category that's like one step down, if you will, from the most severely disabled to the next most severely disabled. So that if you don't have enough funds in a state to fully provide all services, it could be a really significant issue. And students that are going to college tend not to be in this most severe disability category. There are some that are, but most of them would not fit that most severely category definition. So they would get nothing from VR. So there would probably be the need to look at, what is VR doing? How are they funding services? What are they providing for people? What's their financial needs tests? Florida was thinking of going to order of selection. They didn't even have a financial needs test. They actually called me down and I testified somewhere, I don't know where it was, but there was a whole bunch of people in the room. And I said, if you don't have a financial needs test, do that first. That's gives a lot more people the opportunity to get services from VR than the waiting list that goes to the order of selection. So you could look at possibly trying to revamp your financial needs test. You don't want to cut off services because the whole point is to give the people that are there what they need. But there could be ways looking at, are you covering fully your comparable benefits? Are you, is there other things that you're paying for that other entities could be paying for? But that would be something that you want to look at a systemic level in your state.
Okay, we have a question. The last one is from Stephanie Gore. Traditionally, VR does not support post-secondary goals above a bachelor's degree. Perhaps this is different from state to state?
That's the whole point. Yes, it's been traditionally that for years across the country, not just in almost every state. But they've changed because of the WIOA change. The statute itself included advanced degrees, listed science, engineering, mathematics, business, law, medicine, and then the regulation added including but not limited to. So this is a new requirement in the law to expand the legal potential for people to get these advanced degrees that were never able to get in before, or without litigation, or without a lot of advocacy. So this is a good thing. This is like, in terms of WIOA, one of the biggest changes for the people at the higher end of the disability spectrum is the ability to go and get funding from VR for these advanced degrees. Yes.
Okay, we have no more questions. Only one come asking if there's going to be a survey after the webinar. Yes, you will get a survey right after the webinar ends. You will get it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I'm turning it over to the Raise folks to close out the webinar.
Okay, Ron, thank you so much. I think that the number of questions really says how much interest there is and how much we don't know. And so I really appreciate even that extra time that you took with us. As was mentioned, there will be a survey that's going out immediately. This webinar should be captioned and online and sent to all of you within the next week and a half. And you're welcome to share it, watch it again, sit around movie night at home with the family and popcorn, whatever you need to do. We really encourage you to watch it and share it. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on our next webinars. Have a good day, everyone.